Hi, this is Grant with Pfeiffer Forensics, and today we're going to be talking about basic case writing in Lincoln-Douglas debate. Now, one thing that I do want to clarify is we're not going to be going over, advanced strategies or, advanced ways to justify your framework, that type of thing. Instead, this is a video that's for people who either haven't written cases before or were just kind of winging it and don't think they did it the right way. So all we're really going to be talking about is the outline of a case, what are the essential parts of a case, and then how do you go about writing those essential parts in a more basic way. We're talking more about the conceptual ideas here rather than specific strategies for doing it right. So to begin with what's in a case, there's three general, parts of a case, three different layers. The first layer is where you state the resolution, you state your side, and then you offer like definitions and burdens to clarify what it is that we're debating in the first place. The second layer is the framework. And in the framework, you're just arguing, what's the ethical principle that's most important to consider with how we should vote given the topic. And lastly, you talk about the contentions. And those are just your different arguments for your side of the resolution and how it's most consistent with that factor. So the term my first contention is that translates pretty much to the first argument that demonstrates the satisfaction of my value criterion is, so and so. So the point is just you can see there's three distinct layers that interact with each other. So let's begin with the definitions layer. So definitions can be important for some rounds, and there's usually two different ways that they're going to be helpful. The first is they might clarify a confusing topic. For example, on the resolution resolved, the right to be forgotten from internet searches ought to be a civil right. For the first few debate tournaments, a lot of the judges didn't really know what we were talking about at all. So that was something that there would be a strategic advantage to clarifying because the judge would better be able to understand the rest of your arguments. The second way that a definition could be helpful is if it's, affecting important arguments, if it's including or excluding certain arguments that, you might have a reason to want to include or exclude that you might not otherwise be able to. So for one resolution, we were talking about a living wage. So people might, for example, be arguing for different, values that we could use to consider what a living wage would look like. So obviously, whether or not you're going to want a living wage might depend on whether it looks like it's $10 or whether it's $20. But a common novice mistake is reading definitions when you don't really have to. If you're thinking about putting a definition in your case, just consider how likely it is that a certain definition would win you the round. Imagine the scenarios in which that would be the case, and then consider how likely it is that those scenarios are going to occur. And then compare that to the loss of time that you could use to maybe otherwise strengthen your framework or contentions, and just ask if it's worth the loss of time. By no means do you actually have to have any definitions or burden type arguments in your case. If it's a pretty straightforward resolution, it might not be worth the loss of time to read those. One thing though, just to clarify, make sure that at the beginning of your speech, you state what the resolution is and just state your side on it. For example, I affirm that the right to be forgotten from internet searches ought to be a civil right. The next part is the framework, and this is generally speaking the philosophy part of Lincoln-Douglas debate. So framework establishes the ethical principles with which we judge actions, and there are usually two parts to framework. There's the value and the criterion. So the value is just what you're saying is the most important factor for ethical obligations. So, maybe questions like, oh, what's the most important thing, justice or morality? And in terms of what you actually want to use as your value, that's something that you'll want to figure out later on as you get some more experience. But if you just use justice or morality, you'll probably be okay in almost every round. And next, you explain your value criterion, which is, the measuring stick for that factor. What's the most important consideration with that value? So maybe with the value of justice, you're saying that protecting individual rights is the most important consideration. And when you're arguing for your framework, you need to both explain and justify it. Now, this is a very common novice mistake. A lot of novices might just explain what that value criterion is or what that value is, and then not explain why it's a true value or criterion. You have to both explain and justify that value criterion. And in a little bit later in this video, when we're talking about writing a case, we'll go ahead and explain to you how you might go about doing that. And in terms of selecting your value criterion, don't put a square peg in a round hole. Start with the contention level arguments, see what the strongest arguments in the topic are, and then write your value and value criterion after that. In other words, you can have a really, really good framework, but if it's not related to the topic, it's not going to be all that helpful. And then the final part of the case is the contentions. Now, the contention is the debate term for just, what are your main arguments? It's just a term that everybody uses in debate, so, just make sure you're comfortable using the term contention. Contentions just argue for how the topic is right or wrong, a good or bad idea, as per your framework. So in other words, they're the discussion of how your framework applies to the resolution. Make sure all of your contentions explicitly support your framework. And contention should probably be the biggest part of your case. Most judges would rather listen to more discussion of the topic rather than the abstract parts of the framework. It's just a lot easier for some judges to understand. So make sure your framework's clear and well argued for, but you don't want to be spending, 3.5 minutes arguing for your framework in the affirmative constructive. And in terms of how many you should run, 2 to 3 on the affirmative, 3 preferably, and 1 to 2 on the negative. Now, never run more than 3 contentions because there's a good chance, you'll just lose your judge or something like that. 3 tends to be a pretty good number. And even though you probably won't want to be running that, many on the negative all the time, you can if you want to. And just a side note to explain why you don't want 3 on the negative, your negative case should be between 2 and 4 minutes because you also have to argue against your opponent's case in that first speech. So if you've got a really short and well argued for framework and your contentions are really short, then maybe you can have a third contention, but just start with 1 and 2. That's usually a good number. So how do you go about actually writing your contentions? Well, the most important thing you do is do your research, and then you look for the strongest arguments that share a common principle. So let's say that you're on the negative. What you're going to be wanting to do after you look at your research is to group those negative arguments into different categories. So let's say that you found 2 really clear ways that affirming hurts the common good, and you also found 2 really clear ways that affirming violates individual rights. Now, while both of these types of arguments might be really strong and convincing arguments, you shouldn't have both of these in your case because they won't be connected to the same ethical shared principle, because one's talking about the common good and the other's talking about individual rights. This means that you couldn't really write a framework that would allow you to argue for both of those. And in LD, we kind of have to have a framework. So you should just pick one of those categories of arguments and then go about actually turning them into contentions. So in terms of actually writing the case, we're going to talk about how to turn those into contentions. Once again, the first thing that you do is identify the shared principle between your best arguments. So let's say we wanted to go with the individual rights. That's going to be the shared principle. And then obviously, although we're going to have to argue for the framework, I personally think it's easier to write the contentions first, just so you know that you've got a really strong argument before you spend all that time justifying a framework, and then maybe later finding out, oh wait, I can't really argue for this, the topic doesn't really support my position. So after you've identified those strong arguments and the shared principles behind them, you turn those rough arguments into straightforward contentions. So in terms of what a contention looks like, you first begin with the claim, and that's the title of the contention. So it might be, my first contention is that a living wage would violate individual rights for free trade. After you give that claim or the title for the contention, you then give reasons to support it. You give what's called your warrants. And here you just give your logical arguments in support of that claim, and incorporating evidence can be really helpful here. Reading a card to support your claim can be very helpful. And finally, make sure you're doing some analysis, some impacting of this. So explain why it is that your claim is true means that the judge should vote for you, and be explicitly clear how the contention relates to your criterion. And then explain why this means that the judge should or shouldn't vote for you. So once again, the 3 parts you want to do, you want to give your claim, you want to argue for why that claim's true, and then you want to do some analysis for why that matters in the first place. And I would say after you've written your contentions, then you should probably write the framework. And if you're having trouble coming up with the reasons why that framework is true, just try Googling, why, and then insert your ethical principle here is important, and you'll be on the right track. The good thing about ethics and philosophy is that a lot of people have written about it, and there's a lot of intuitive arguments for why certain things are or are not important. So lastly, we'll talk about justifying frameworks, how to turn those general ideas into actually, sensible arguments. So there are specific strategies for how you could strategically justify frameworks, but I don't want you to worry about them for now. Just get used to writing these in the first place, and then we'll talk about the best way to do that in a later video. So the first thing you offer is your value. You explain your ethical principle and why it's important, not just in general, but also explicitly to answering the question posed by the resolution. So maybe a resolution questioned just governments or ask some question incorporating that phrase. You might say, I value justice to find us to each their due because the resolution questions the obligations of just governments, meaning justice is the evaluative term for the resolution or the standard of evaluation we must be using. And after you give that value, you give your value criterion, and this is the test for determining whether or not we're consistent with that value. So what a value criterion would look like is, you say, in order to determine if the value of justice is being met, I offer the value criterion of, and then, maybe in this case it's protecting individual rights for 2 reasons. And then you just give your reasons for why using that value criterion is necessary to understanding whether or not your value is being met. One thing that I do want to say is that your value criterion will usually be, and probably should be, longer than your value. There's not a lot of times in which people are going to disagree that justice is a good thing. In a lot of debates, especially if it's got a straightforward evaluative term like just governments, both debaters will agree on the value. And then most of the debate, in terms of the framework level, is spent on the value criterion. So make sure your value criterion is really well justified. In terms of how you want to spend your time on the framework, the value criterion is probably a safer bet to have the more substantive arguments. And if you're feeling overwhelmed right now, don't worry. Until you get more experience, don't worry about having a really strategic case. Instead, just make sure your case explains what's important for us to consider and then offers a few reasons why voting for your side is important with that consideration. Don't worry about doing anything specific, just worry about writing decent cases before you go for more complicated ones. And if your first few tournaments out, you're getting beat just by more experienced debaters, don't get frustrated. LD can be really tough to learn. Just stick with it, try your best, and you'll get better. It's the kind of thing that whenever you're dealing with new debaters, a lot of people will get frustrated. They'll feel like they can't succeed because they'll see a lot of their friends in other events might be having more immediate success. Just stick with it. Once again, it will get better. LD has a strong learning curve, but once you master that learning curve, it's a really, really fun event. So this is all we have for casing for today. Once again, later on, we will be offering some videos on more advanced strategic ways to write cases, advanced ways to justify frameworks, that type of thing. But for now, just worry about writing a straightforward, logical argument. Don't worry too much about the strategy behind it. Just make sure it makes sense, and you'll get better from there. This has been Grant with Fight for Forensics. Thank you.